right, thank you all for coming. My name's Posner. I work for Bureau of Reclamation, and that was a perfect segue into what we're going to be talking about now. Talking about more of the management and the history of the Middle Rio Grande. Going now that we have a sense of kind of the physical processes that are going on in the river. You'll have to pardon me because I haven't spoken in front of a live audience for a long time. So if I stumble, and please forgive me. I did try to pack a lot in, so I'm also going to try to go kind of quickly. We're going to talk a little bit about the early history, just to try to create context for what we see now. So the developing of the Middle Rio Grande, maintaining it, how Reclamation does our planning, and then talk a little bit about some of the current projects. And you'll be seeing a lot of historical photos. This is one that shows the alkalinity in the soils that was seen in the 30s. That was the inspiration for a lot of work. I leaned for this early part. I leaned really hard on these two sources, which if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend. One is this report by Frank Wozniak that was done by the Forest Service called The Irrigation of the Rio Grande Valley. And it starts way back in the beginning and all the way to, I guess, 97. And then also this book called Raining in the Rio Grande that has a lot of excellent material in it. So just a quick timeline, I guess, hopefully quick. I'm just going to start with when New Mexico was declared a territory. There was obviously a lot of stuff that happened before then. I think the big difference is that, and the distinction that I think is important, is that prior to this time period, much of the irrigation was subsistence irrigation, and it wasn't necessarily an industrial type of irrigation that you see later on after General Watts takes his cavalry into Santa Fe. So at that time, in about 1870, up in the Upper Rio Grande, there were about 30,000 cattle and 350,000 sheep and goats. In 1878, the railroad begins on Raton Pass, and within 3 years, there's railroads across New Mexico. That was a huge impact. In 1889, the San Luis Valley irrigation diversion is completed and can now divert 3,500 CFS. And so you can imagine by 1900, with the ability to divert all that water, with the railroads here to move material and move goods in and out of the area. So by 1900, that 30,000 cattle has now grown to 150,000 cattle, and the 350,000 sheep and goats has grown to 1.6 million sheep and goats. So this is all over. This is within the Rio Grande watershed, from San Luis, the Sangre de Cristos, the Jemez, etc. There were sawmills, quarries, freighting, mining, construction. Now there were 300,000 acres irrigated in the San Luis Valley, and 32,000 in the Middle Valley. Drying begins below Albuquerque for the first time in anybody's memory. And the other thing that happened was waterlogging. The waterlogging was due to, in large degree, channel aggradation, which is something that Mike talked about. However, it's hard to not imagine that all the logging and mining didn't also contribute to a lot of that channel aggradation, right? And the other thing that was happening was all the farming wasn't centralized. There was no irrigation districts. And so when a farmer got his land, he built an irrigation ditch, he built a drain, but there was no coordination between the different farmers. And so up in the Upper Rio Grande and in the tributaries, many of the historic drains would spill out into Cienega, right? And that was kind of the terminus of the drain. And when you have high slopes, that doesn't become a big issue. Here in the Middle Valley, where you have very low slopes, those Cienegas would eventually start to waterlog all the fields and your neighbor's fields, etc. And so there were all these private irrigation companies that were trying to get the farmers to sell them their irrigation rights, and we'll do it for you. But the farmers didn't trust them, and so they said, we're not going to sell you anything. And 90% of the private irrigation companies went bankrupt because nobody wanted to sell their water rights. In 1914, a second set of tracks was built across New Mexico, requiring 16 million ties. There were trestle bridges. Apparently, I remember reading like one trestle bridge is the equivalent to like 100 homes or something like that. So there was a lot of huge impact by the development of the valley here that happened in a relatively short amount of time. In 1918, 675,000 cords of wood was consumed. And by 1925, the district is formed in part because 58,000 acres of the valley are waterlogged. Soon afterward, there was a huge flood of 1929 that destroyed the villages of San Acacia, San Antonio, San Marcial, irreparable damage to the irrigation systems, etc. And that really kind of spurred the district to start building, right? And in that time period between 30 and 36, they built El Vado. They built the 4 diversion dams, including Coach V diversion, which is kind of neat to see the photo of the diversion prior to what we see today. The siphon was built, these headings, which I didn't really know about, and it's pretty neat to see where they were and what they look like today. These were places where irrigation was diverted without a valley-wide dam. There were 760 miles of canals constructed or rehabilitated, and 342 miles of riverside drains. You can imagine this was a huge, very exciting for the farmers of the valley to get all this work done. The compact was signed, and then in the early 40s, the valley saw some of the largest floods again that it had ever seen. At San Marcial recorded almost 24,000 CFS. So you can imagine that had a huge impact, and now all the work that was done, they had an enormous amount of aggradation occurred again. And now the aggradation had lifted the river up so that the drains no longer could function. And so now you had again all this waterlogging going on. And on top of that, a lot of the vegetation was clogging the drains. Those big floods punctured through levees. And in 47, Reclamation and the Corps signed a memorandum of understanding, dividing up the flood control and reclamation activities. And in 1955, Steve Reynolds is appointed the state engineer. There is a very interesting biography of Steve Reynolds. He was a very important character in the history of the Rio Grande. He did a couple things. So one of the things was that it was the 13th straight year of compact debit for New Mexico. And he identified 2 things. One was the groundwater pumping. There was no control on groundwater pumping in the valley. And so he declared it the Rio Grande groundwater basin, which gave the state the ability to regulate some of the pumping on the farms. And then he also teamed up with Reclamation to channelize the middle Rio Grande. And this is kind of showing some of the stuff that Mike showed. This is kind of what they found when they got there. These are the hydrographs that they, the 41 and 42. You could see in 41, they had 23,000 in June or whatever, but even late in the year, it got up to 7,000. So it was a huge year. I think one of the things that I also wanted to point out is that we talk about the Rio Grande as being this a graded river historically. This kind of anastomose river with all these mid-channel bars. But what you also see, it's also meandering, right? So there's these kind of 2 things happening at the same time. At a larger scale, it's meandering. At a finer scale, there's all these islands and bars that are crisscrossing the channel. But there is also the river's obviously going from one levee, bouncing up against one levee, and then swinging across the valley to bounce up against the other levee. So in the 50s, Steve Reynolds and Reclamation teamed up in particular to salvage water. You can see on the upper right there, that's San Marcial Lake. And that's in part due to the filling of Elephant Butte, right? Because Elephant Butte filled, and that was able to back up the delta upstream. And then you see some of the equipment there that was used to clear a channel through the south. This is, basically trying to get that water from San Marcial Lake down to Elephant Butte. They tried to control the salt cedar and had failed at that, and so they decided, all right, we're just going to dredge a channel because we can't control the salt cedar with mowing, etc. The other thing that was done was a lot of jetty jacks were installed. This was done to protect banks and to narrow the river. Most of these are down south. This one at the bottom right here is the San Juan or the San Francisco drain. So that's kind of Bernardo, Rio Cuervo area. And now into the 60s, now we're basically the low flow has come online. And so the low flow conveyance channel is now moving a lot of that water down through the southern part. It's moving all the water, especially during low flows. A lot of floodway clearing is happening, chemical spraying by helicopter to control channel phreatophytes, which is obviously something that we value very much today. They were root plowing, raking. Here, I thought this was interesting that in the 60s, they identify a point containing erosion-resistant clay, which is something we just talked about. And they're pointing out here, and pilot channel is proposed across this point. So this is something that's been going on for a very long time. And here's a photo of the floodway in Albuquerque. So excavating point bar channels. In the 60s, they said that there's about 7,000 acres of floodway from Cochiti to Rio Cuervo, and they envisioned 1,600 acres requiring annual clearing and maintenance. So in the 70s, this is when all that work starts to kind of pay dividends, I suppose. And this is known as Mount Reynolds, which you can see here. This is when he became engineer. This is the debit. So positive means that that New Mexico is in debit. Negative means that it's in credit. And so by the 70s, there's an actual credit in New Mexico. Here you can see some of that jetty jack, the impacts of those jetty jacks that are installed. They did, here, so the river is right up on the levee and on the canal, and you can see they put the jetty jacks in, and it's done a very effective job at pushing the river away from that infrastructure. So those jetty jacks are pretty extensive. They are also down south, but these are the jetty jacks kind of through, I guess, this upper portion. They begin around Bernalillo and end around Bernardo. I kind of did a zoom in here so you can see a little bit better what they look like, these tiebacks. And then they're generally on the outer bank, on the outside of the bends, to try to keep the river away from the infrastructure. They also had to do a lot of second lines of jetty jacks in the 70s. The first line did its job. A lot of material deposited behind them. Vegetation encroached on that material. But then due to aggradation, they had additional flooding issues. And so second lines of jetty jacks, and I'm sure you've all seen this if you've wandered around the Bosque in Albuquerque. There was still mechanical clearing going on. There was also, I thought this was interesting, where the maintenance crews pushed back the bank line. And so a lot of the perching that we might see is actually a result of these maintenance activities, where they didn't worry so much about taking the sediment out of the channel, but they just pushed the sediment up into the floodplain to make space for the river. And so that sediment wasn't necessarily pulled out of the system. It was just kind of pushed up into the bank lines. And then some mowing and clearing. There was a lot of herbicide spraying that happened by helicopter, some pilot channel dredging. Here you can see the Bernardo Reach. This is, after the mowing and clearing and a pilot channel. There was this thing they called a prototype. Was in Bernardo. There was a prototype reach that was very channelized and highly controlled, and that was the idea, was we could, the reclamation could recreate this. This is further south. You can see again the clearing in the pilot channel. Some more photos from the 70s. I thought this one was probably the most interesting. This is south of San Acacia Diversion Dam, and you can see where they've pushed the material up into the historic floodplain, or I guess the older floodplain, and all the clearing that occurred then. So now we're in the 80s, and the 80s kind of got exciting again because of the high water. So this is the annual volumes, and you can see the 80s had a lot of water, and what that resulted in was more flooding, the need for more jetty jacks due to that flooding, and some big issues down at the terminus of the low flow conveyance channel. The 90s, they were also had quite a lot of high water and issues with the conveyance channel. The Elephant Butte Delta channel dredging kind of began in earnest, needing kind of annual maintenance. Additional jetty jacks and bank lines, mowing was done. Here's a sandbar that's mowed just below New Mexico 6th Bridge. And then there was a big plug that happened in the Tiffany Basin. So this is kind of pulled from the 1990 report. Most of these are from Middle Rio Grande inspection reports that were done. Here's that same island. You can see here is being mowed, and here they're saying, well, it hasn't been mowed for a while, and maybe it needs to. But this is in 1990. There was still a lot of high water, so there was still a lot of flooding. And what they're saying, I'll just read this if you don't mind. Flood control diversion channels operated by Albuquerque Metro Flood Control Authority enter the Rio Grande north and south of the city. A number of middle islands have formed at the confluence of the North Diversion Channel. That's, again, we see that today. That's kind of the beginning of a lot of the islands. Arroyos in the Albuquerque division have continued to build more sediment bars in the absence of high flows to remove the sediment. This condition was observed at the confluence of Arroyo Calabacillas, just upstream of Paseo del Norte. Arroyo has deposited sediment and debris fan in the Rio Grande on the west bank of Alameda, northern suburb. There has been a need to remove sediment deposits at the site in the past to maintain floodway capacity. The removal of sediment in this area should continue with ongoing maintenance. Throughout the Albuquerque division, vegetation growing in the sediment bars is mowed annually. If shrubs and trees were allowed to grow in the islands and bars, the channel roughness may increase, which could cause levees to overtop during flood flows. Furthermore, if not controlled, trees and shrubs would erode during high flows. Yeah, right, we wish. And collected at bridge piers, the debris would restrict floods under the bridges, and vegetated islands could restrict main channel flows toward the levees. So you can see, I guess I put this up there as a point that this is something that Reclamation and folks in the valley have been thinking about and talking about for a long time. But it's important to remember that this, in the 1990s, there was very high water, right? So they were saying year after year of a lot of water at this time, water that we haven't seen in 2 decades or more. So now we get into more of the modern kind of paradigm that we live in, and this is the 2003 BO was signed. We've got the Clean Water Act is being implemented, and obviously there's endangered species. So, you know, Reclamation's authorities providing effective transport, conserving water, protecting infrastructure, eliminating degradation and aggradation, and providing habitat improvements. The way we try to think about it now is to support channel stability, protecting infrastructure, ecosystem compatibility, and effective water delivery. So what that kind of looks like is in promoting elevation stability. So we don't want too much aggradation or degradation. We want to promote alignment stability to allow lateral adjustments and then only stabilize bank lines when needed. Reconstructing and maintaining the capacity and increasing available area. Providing more space for those channel processes, rehabilitating the channel and floodplain, increasing that connectivity, whether it's to the historic or to kind of these existing bars and islands, and then managing the sediment to try to balance the transport and capacity and supply. And the idea being that all these projects have a net ecological benefit. So no matter what we're doing in the river, whether it's bank protection or increasing available area, that they have a net positive benefit to the endangered species. The way we do this is using what we call maintenance classes, and this is a way that we can prioritize the sites that we work in. Maintenance classes are from 1 to 5, 1 being that it's unplanned, that the consequences are substantial. So these would be like emergency type of operations. 2 is something that would be planned, but also has a significant impact and is substantial. These might be newer existing sites. 3A and B are things that are less likely substantial, so we're not worried about some levee breaking down or the water getting into one of the canals, etc. They're more preventative investigations. And then 4 and 5 are quite low, and those would be other things that we want to monitor, etc. I would say that the islands and bars may cause class 1 and 2 sites, and I'll talk about that a little later, but the vast majority of the islands and bars would be considered 3A, 3B, and class 4, because they're not likely to cause some substantial issue with the infrastructure protection, etc., or conveyance downstream for that matter. So the way that we look at each site is with these 2 different factors, a likelihood-based factor and a value-based factor, and those look at channel capacity loss, proximity to infrastructure, the rate of lateral movement. So all these issues, when we look at a site, we're looking at all these factors and rating each of those factors to decide how serious is this site? How quickly do we need to address whatever's happening there? These factors are all synthesized using this strategy where we combine them and try to create, by combining the different factors, we create this likelihood for river maintenance need. And then that likelihood for river maintenance need is input into this kind of flow chart that combines both the value-based factors and this likelihood-based factor, and you end up with a public health and safety need and a water delivery need. And so depending on, and so each site we look at has these values so that we can prioritize where we should be working in the river. So one of the things that we do, how am I doing on time? Okay. All right. So one of the things that we do to get at this is we talk about width, right? And Mike talked about the width of the river, and obviously the development of channel islands and bars you can think of as width change, right? So so one of the things we do is we do these reach analyses. We're collecting data all the time. We're just getting ready to analyze our 2022 data set. So this is super exciting for us because the last data set that we had that covers the entire river is 2012. So we're anticipating seeing a lot of new things in the 2022 data that's just in the process of getting analyzed right now. But these are some of the reach analyses that we've done over the last several years with Colorado State University. And they are looking at, these are plots of the vegetated width. It's important to distinguish the wetted top width from the vegetated width, right? Those are 2 different things, of the wetted top width being the result of usually a model or some data collection where you're looking at a certain discharge and the width associated with that discharge. What you're looking at here are the vegetated widths. And obviously you can see there's been quite a dramatic decrease through most of the reaches. These are all the different sub-reaches that are broken down. Some of the things that you do see is widening in the 80s, right? Kind of what Mike was talking about, more water, more width, right? So those 80s and early 90s were really wet, and you do see some widening there. The other thing that we did was we asked the Technical Services Center, which is up in Denver, that they kind of do more of the kind of background, not necessarily project-based analyses. And so we asked them to look at the design width. As you guys know, there was the Rio Grande was that Middle Rio Grande project was designed to be 600 in Albuquerque and 550 in Belen. And so we actually have the data that was used to develop those designs. So we were able to go back and recreate their analysis. And one of the things that we found was that the 1961 equation doesn't even predict the data set from which it was derived. So they really just kind of threw a dart on the map with this whole 600, 550 thing. The tools that they had available to them were very, very crude compared to what we have today. Computers make these kinds of analyses much easier, right? So with the absence of computers, they were stuck with log plot, putting dots on a log plot axis and things like that. And they had to do a lot of simplifications and whatnot. And so we took their data and did a more modern statistical analysis on it, and we're able to derive equations that actually make a lot more sense and actually match the data that they were collecting. A couple things that I wanted to point out here that I thought were really interesting is that they also identified these different phases in the width. They obviously had this design width, but then in their conception, phase one was the historic conditions with Elvado Reservoir. Phase two was the interim conditions with Elvado, Abiquiu, Jemez Canyon, and San Juan Chama. And then phase three was all of those things with Cochiti and Galisteo reservoirs. So they kind of had they were already conceiving of how the width would change as these different infrastructure came online. And what you see is that, in Belen now they're predicting widths in the order of 150 to 190 feet. Once Cochiti is in Albuquerque, in the 640 to 320, and in Cochiti still fairly wide, because they weren't thinking about all the degradation that was going to happen. And so interestingly, we don't see this up here is an analysis looking at Belen de Bernardo, and Bernardo de Rio Cuerpo, which are these three here. And what we see is we're looking more on the almost 300, 250 foot widths, and they're predicting a little bit narrower. So we're actually a little bit wider than they were predicting there. But this analysis kind of, I showed this because it kind of goes to what Mike was talking about in terms of relating the width and the discharge, and this idea that the river is actually responding to the existing conditions, right? So that's what we're seeing here, is the river responding to the hydrologic and sediment regime of the current channel. And then I'll just briefly touch on a couple current projects that we have in the hopper that we're hoping to get on the ground soon. This first one, and this also gets to this difference with the islands and bars depending on where you are in the river. So upstream in around Parala Sandia, what we see is when these islands and bars develop, we see the river wanting to meander around those. And the sharper that turn is around the river, the harder it comes, the more normal it is to the bank line, right? The more perpendicular it comes to the bank line. And so the islands and bars upstream end up causing bank erosion, which is a big problem. And so one of the solutions is we try not to just rip wrap the entire river, right? We don't want that for ecological reasons, etc. So one of the things that we can do is provide area to the river. And what you see here is we're digging through those point bars to allow the water to get through the point bar and reduce that pressure on the bank lines. Same solution they were talking about in the 60s, right? And these are, permanent features at this point because of the clay, the gravel, the vegetation. Down south in the Belen area, river in Las Lunas area, what we see is when those islands and bars grow, we don't see the river wanting to meander because at this point, the river is now, it's not as sediment starved as it is upstream like it is at Cochiti. right? And so here in Las Lunas, we're not seeing a ton of degradation anymore. It's actually quite stable, but we are seeing quite a bit of narrowing from the development of these bars and islands. And so we're not so much worried about bank erosion, but what we're worried about is the overtopping of the levees, right? Because those bars and islands have taken so much area within that active channel, that now we have overbanking and much lower flows. And so the solution to that is channel widening, right? So rather than trying to cut through these point bars, because it's not so much this kind of classic point bar shape, that we're looking at channel widening. And we went through quite a bit of iterations using our models. And one of the things that we're leaning toward is, rather than in the past, maybe we would build a high flow channel to try to create more area that might be separate from the main channel. But rather than doing that, because those high flow channels, we know sediment in quite quickly, especially those entry and exit points. And so you may have the high flow channel, but then the entry and exit points are graded, which eliminates the effectiveness of your channel. So we'll be doing more benching and widening of the river rather than trying to create a second channel. So these are just some examples of some current projects that we're doing. There's more, obviously. There's a lot going on down south in the Bosque del Apache area with the realignments, but those aren't necessarily about bars and islands. So some key takeaways that very similar to what Mike's were about in terms of these bars and islands colonizing the river is a natural reoccurring process exacerbated by reducing peak flows and extending low flow water operations. At flood flows, bars and islands may exacerbate bank erosion and overbank flooding, and that may be desirable in some areas, right? Some areas we want that overbank flooding. In other areas, it may be problematic. So there's no one size fits all. At low flows, the channel narrowing actually results in greater conveyance efficiency, right? The narrower is going to shoot on downstream. It's just when it goes overbank is when the efficiency starts to reduce. Stable geometry for transporting flows and sediment is not the same as those determined in 61 for the original channelization. We've got very different conditions now. Regular assessments are used to prioritize river maintenance needs through the systematic classification process. And finally, the most effective solution will be one that is coordinated between all agencies that have water management and environmental stewardship responsibilities. And that's part of the reason why we're all here today. So that's all I have, and thanks for hearing me.